Hello and welcome. I'm Hilda, and I'm a librarian here at the Los Angeles Public Library. Today we have a program called Grief 101 with Elisa Fornere from Pause. This session is part of a larger program series called Thrive LA, which provides free hands-on learning that helps Angelinos build practical life skills, navigate key life transitions, and access trusted community resources. The series strengthens personal and environmental resilience while fostering connection, shared learning, and a stronger sense of community through the library. Please look out for the programs in this series throughout the rest of the year. Um, we will have a brief Q&A at the end of the session or at the end of the presentation. So please put your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation and they'll be answered in the Q&A session. This program has been recorded, so if you miss any part of it, make sure to watch the playback on YouTube, which hopefully you're here on YouTube now. And now I will hand it over to Elisa.
Thank you, Hilda. Hello, everyone. I'm Elisa Fornere. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the founder and executive director of a nonprofit here in Los Angeles called Pause. So, like I said, I'm Elisa, but just to sort of ground here as a human bigger than the work that I do, I am a mother to a 4.5-year-old. I am a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a sister. I'm also a gardener. I'm in the process of rotating my beds right now after harvesting a ton of tomatoes. So I feel very much like I can step into the gardener tile. I'm a cookbook lover, and this was not switched, but the food that will bring me joy at the end of my life is French fries. But the question for today is actually related to how we move through our grief. And one of the ways that I move through my grief is actual movement and exercise. It used to be kickboxing, but we'll talk about that a little later right now. So I would love for anyone that's here present today just to share a little bit about yourselves as well. So I'd love to hear in the chat your name, how you ended up here today, when you saw something titled Grief 101 pop up, and when it was promoted to you, what made you say, yeah, I'd go watch that, listen in on that, attend that? Is it that you wanted to learn more about your own grief or grief in general, maybe for your job? You were looking for resources, specific resources for your grief or someone else's. Maybe you're supporting someone who's grieving and you wanted a little bit more information, or all of the above. Grief is, even I sit from a place of talking about this every day, but, over the many years that I've done this work, it has become apparent to me that at all times, grief is present in our lives and in our world. So maybe you are supporting someone, supporting yourself, and really curious about learning. And then the last question that I invite folks to answer today is, what helps you move through your grief? For me, after my mom, Deborah, died 11 years ago, I did physical movement and kickboxing, really to process the grief that I was carrying in my body, and also to have an outlet for a lot of the energy that was coming up as I was grieving. I had anger, I had sadness, I had jealousy, I had confusion. And so processing through physical movement was really important for me to regulate around my grief. For some of you, I put some examples here on the screen. It might be that you process your grief by resting and sleeping. It might be that you process your grief by cooking, and maybe that's cooking the recipes that someone passed down to you, or recipes that really provide you deep nourishment that make you feel supported internally and physically in your grief. And maybe, especially if you're coming here for library programming, you might process your grief through reading, whether that's reading for pleasure or reading books and different texts and resources that specifically cover how we can move through and process our own grief. To share a little bit more, as y'all share about yourselves, as an organization, again, our name is Pause, and the mission of Pause is to create spaces that provide safe, culturally specific, and expert-informed grief and end-of-life resources, specifically serving communities of color. We're based here in California in Los Angeles, but we serve folks across the country. And our work really lives at this intersection of what does grief support look like and how do we ensure that folks have access to it? What does end of life education look like and how do we ensure that folks have access to it? How do we build community care into how folks are caring for each other through grief and serious illness and death? And then also, how do we center a lot of our work around recognizing that there's action to be taken, that there's work to be done, and that there's processing to do, but also what comes with this work inevitably is the need to rest and to heal. So we believe that planning ahead, finding resources, and taking care of and acknowledging our grief is not just about fear. It shouldn't just be about, well, are my people going to be supportive? Am I going to be able to get over this one day? Which I believe is, we'll talk a little bit about sort of how we process grief and the fact that it can live with us forever. But it can also be about having clarity about what the resources are out there, clarity about what it is that we're feeling in our bodies and our minds, dignity in terms of accessing resources that are respectful of us and our identity and who we are. And then also planning ahead, thinking ahead, and addressing things like our grief and our mental health are critical for us to be able to care for outside of just what we're able to do for ourselves. There's a couple of agreements that I want to bring into the space, as well as a disclaimer. So we always invite folks, come as you are. We and I truly expect nothing of you other than curiosity. If you're here and you want to be in the chat, please engage. If you're here and you want to listen passively or receive this information passively, there is no shame in that. But really for us, all we ask is that you're here with us today, and that if this feels a little heavy for you, that you're able to step away and maybe return at another time. As Hilda said, this is being recorded. I also am going to invite folks to share in the chat throughout this session. And so I encourage you to only share what feels comfortable. Maybe you're here because you wanted an outlet and you wanted someone who was going to see you and what you're experiencing, and you want to share that in the chat. And maybe a question feels a little trickier and an answer isn't coming to mind. Please feel free to only share what feels comfortable. And also, I want to honor the really deep complexity about how grief and death and health and identity show up in LA and here in California. Who we are, and I'll talk quite a bit about this today, but who we are, our experience, our families, our access, really impact the way that we're able to receive care and be held by care professionals and folks that are doing work in this space. And so I just want to start by saying that I deeply honor the complexity of how these things show up in our lives, and also in the ways that we're able to receive resources and access resources and take advantage of resources if we're able to. And the last sort of disclaimer is that this is an educational space. This is not legal or medical advice. And that said, I will always say we have referrals to connect you to. You will hear a lot about different resources, both hyper local to here in Los Angeles, but also national, both in-person, virtual. If you are looking for specific information about a resource or a topic that I covered, please feel free to reach out. You will find my contact information at the end of this. And also, I think Hilda's able to share that in the chat, but we are here to say, here's the information and sort of paths that we can point folks down to be able to be taken care of or advocate for resources for themselves. We can make a lot of introductions depending on whether or not we know these resources. And then from there, we hope that you find what you need and that we're just sort of a stepping stone along your journey of finding care. I always start all of our sessions with this quote from Alok, and I think, for us, we as an organization are not only opening the door to invite folks in to ask questions and to be in community with each other, but we're encouraging it. Things like grief are already, the fact that you're here in this room and that you're here meeting us in this is a huge step. It's something that we recognize as being, a deeply, for some folks, complicated or complex or intimate topic to be learning around or being in conversation around. And so what we like to land these sessions and all of our sessions and time with folks with is this quote that says, "Thank you for coming into the room. We opened this door so that we can be together and ask questions, be curious, and support each other in finding answers." So I'll start our session today with this quote. "What's so gracious and wonderful and powerful about saying we don't know is that inscribed in the DNA of that sentence is, can you help me figure it out? Why would we want to be absolute? Why would we want to be perfect? Those are all synonyms for loneliness, because if we knew everything, then we wouldn't need each other. What's pretty gnarly about not knowing is that we get to ask questions. And what's pretty cool about a question is that it's an invitation to community." So I encourage folks today to ask questions, to, just be here with me, ask questions after if you choose to, but to know that this is a space where I don't have it all figured out. I don't have the answer to every question, but my responsibility as, a resource and a provider and a nonprofit leader and just a human in this space is to be with you along this path of figuring out where you might find the answers. And we can do that together. So for this session, this will be a standalone session just about Grief 101. We're also doing additional programming around End of Life 101 and asking different end of life and health and grief professionals through sort of like an AMA series. But today what we're going to go through is how our organization talks about and frames grief, bereavement, and mourning, how intersectionality and identity play a role in how grief shows up for us and how we're able to receive care. And then from there, I'm going to move through a ton of like resourcing and activities, and then we'll end with the Q&A. So this first section is really just about defining our terms. And for us, in this session, I will talk mostly about grief in terms of the internal experience that we're having related to a loss. But then there's also terms that you might have heard like bereavement. Maybe that's related to bereavement leave at your job, or mourning related to the practices of how we show up and externally process our grief. So I just wanted to go through these three terms, and it is not as simple as these three bullet points that I have below, but just so that we can start to think about what do we mean by grief, what might be the difference with mourning, and what might be the difference with bereavement. So first, grief is this internal experience of responding to a loss, and this might be any type of loss. It can affect us mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. So I always talk about grief in our team, and a lot of folks in this work talk about grief as not only being the emotions that we feel or the mental state that we're in after a loss, but also where does grief show up maybe in our bodies that might not have a thought or something that we can articulate attached to it, but it is our grief impacting our experience of how we move through the world. Again, I'll share in all of our sessions just a lot about my personal experience and how I ended up here. As I mentioned, my mom, Deborah, died unexpectedly 11 years ago. And it was really interesting because I'd been working on this project about grief and death. And I'd known, grief is maybe the emotions that we feel. I'd heard about 5 steps in certain contexts, and the 5 stages with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And which, we have like a whole new framing for it now as we, understand that was her putting that in a very different context. But I'd heard about grief and these ideas of how does grief show up in our brains. But one day after my mom died, I was running up this hill with my husband, my now husband. It was hot. It wasn't long after she died, and I was just moving. And one of those sprints up at the top of the hill, I just burst into tears. And thankfully, my husband was very tuned in to the fact that I'd been struggling, just sort of in the process of understanding like what is even going on now that my mom is dead with my body, my brain, all of this. And, we both recognized after sitting down and taking a moment, I was like, why am I crying? Why can't I stop? What is this release? And it had become very clear by the end of that day and that conversation that we had that my body being able to open up in a vulnerable way when it was so tired from all of this running really was me processing something in a way that wasn't me being able to say words to him or me having thoughts about my mom, but it was me releasing something internal that had been building and building and compounding, that needed to get out. This was around, if I remember correctly, this was around either Mother's Day or the anniversary of my mom's death. And so my grief and all of this stuff that had been bubbling up was sort of sitting inside of me, and it needed a way to get out. So that's just an example of, outside of grief being what we are feeling emotionally or processing mentally, it can show up in these other ways. Bereavement typically refers to this state that we're in after experiencing a loss. You'll typically hear this related to death and maybe a bereavement policy or bereavement leave. And it describes this period and sort of a time frame of adjustment, and just sort of normalization to this new way of life without our person. And I'll, caveat here that yes, it might be this adjustment after losing someone that's important to us. But when we talk about grief and what we can grieve and what it can be related to, it might not just be a person or an individual in our lives, maybe like a pet, but it can be this period of bereavement can show up and grief can show up as we process it in many types of loss. Then mourning is how we're expressing our grief outwardly, externally. So this might include rituals that you practice after a loss. It might include the traditions that are typical in your family or your culture that take place that are directly related to a loss. Maybe community practices that you do with folks in your immediate community or the wider community, like vigils, or personal ways that you have developed to honor a loss. But mourning is how we bring it into the space outside of just our bodies typically, and being able to publicly, externally, outwardly process, honor, and ritualize this moving through grief. So again, very simply, if I was to distill everything that I just said, grief is what we're feeling and processing, can be what we're feeling and processing on the inside. Bereavement can be this experience or this state of loss and this adjustment, this time-bound maybe adjustment period. And then mourning is how we're expressing it outwardly. And again, I just want to state that when I'm talking about grief, typically in our work, we are talking about death-related loss because of the work that our nonprofit does. But this grief can show up in many different ways. So it can be losses related to health, a relationship like a breakup or a divorce, or just some sort of family rift. It can be related to the loss of an identity that you hold, a loss of safety that you feel, a loss of community that you are attached to, or even in this abstract sense, a future that we maybe planned for or imagined, the loss of that, the change of plans, and the unexpected shifting of what we were hoping our lives, our experience in the world might look like. When that changes, we can grieve that as well. So one framework that can be incredibly helpful when we're thinking about grief, rather than being 5 stages that we go through or it being linear and then we're able to start and finish grieving, is this concept of the dual process model. While we're dealing with bereavement in this period of how are we adjusting and reorienting to life, or as we're moving through grief, what might our everyday experience look like? So this model, the dual process model, reminds us that grief is not just something that we move through in a straight line, but instead we're moving back and forth between these different experiences. So the first is these loss-oriented experiences and this loss-oriented coping. So this is when we're really focused specifically and directly on the loss itself. So we're feeling sadness, we're feeling longing, we're feeling this experience of the grief being deep and this weight of what has changed. And then the second is this restoration-oriented coping. So that's when we focus on adapting to life after loss. So attending to those changes that have come up in our life, doing new things. It could be distraction from grief or the experience that we're having and what we're holding, or also generally just we are doing other things as our life starts to shape into this new normal and new reality. So, what typically happens for most folks is that they move back and forth between both. One of the things that I had to learn, as I started processing my own grief and learning, a lot about the reality of what my personal experience was that some days I would feel really heavy. And those days might be seemingly random. They might be attached to an anniversary. They might be attached to a new other shift in my life that triggers something related to my mom or my loss. And then there might be these other days that you feel and that I felt focused on just getting through life, doing my job, capable of feeling joy or just calm and stability in ways that I wasn't able to at certain moments when I was processing, very specific parts of my grief. And so the important thing for me to learn, and that I think was incredibly helpful for me to learn, was that this doesn't mean that I'm going backwards. It doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, I thought I was finished grieving and I'm not. And when is it going to end? But that I knew and learned over time with this dual process model and understanding it is that we move back and forth through this. We can move toward those moments of joy, those moments of routine and normalcy, and then also move back through these moments of being sitting deeply with it. So it can be really this oscillation that's not a straight line. It's this continual movement between this feeling of loss and learning how to live and proceed with our lives alongside it. This next part of what I'm going to go through is really something that is deeply sort of, I think, precious and foundational to the work that we do and why we stepped into this work at Pause and why I founded the organization. And it's really because it was incredibly helpful for me to learn and for so many of the folks that we've served over the years, to then learn with our programming and the work that we do, that our grief and the experience that we have with grief is not just related to maybe whether or not we have access to certain resources. And it really can be related to, and for many folks is related to, who we are as an individual and the many intersections of our identity. So again, grief can be this wide range of emotional, mental, social, cultural, spiritual, physical, emotional responses associated with the death or a loss. It's this embodied, I like to say, this full body, full being experience related to a loss, and all the ways that we learn to live after a loss. And on top of that, grief intersects with our identity. And when we talk about identity, this refers to our sense of who we are as individuals and as members of a social group. So it also refers to our sense of how others may perceive and label us. One of my favorite quotes around this, I'll share right now, just around the complexity of what identity is, not only how we define ourselves, but how it's shaped by those around us, the experiences we have, and also others' lenses and opinions about who we are. So the concept of identity is a complex one, shaped by individual characteristics, but also family dynamics, historical factors, and social and political contexts. Who am I? I love this question. I feel like I answer it differently so many ways, so many days, because the answer depends in large part on who the world around me says I am. Who do my parents say I am? Who do my peers say I am? What messages reflected back to me in the faces and the voices of my teachers, my neighbors, my store clerks? What do I learn from the media about myself? How am I represented in the cultural images around me, or am I missing from the picture altogether? So this really just paints this picture for me of, I know that there's a version of myself that I can put on the screen where I say, I identify racially as this way. I identify my sexual orientation in this way. I identify my gender in this way. But when I step outside of my door, my identity can be perceived in different ways by other folks, and it doesn't necessarily change. And sometimes it does. If I'm like, ooh, that's a term, a concept, a feeling about who I am that feels new and relevant and resounds with who I am. But it doesn't have to change who I feel I am at my core. The last piece of this is, all right, so we understand, what we're talking about when we say grief. We understand what we're talking about when we say identity, what makes up who we are. And then there's this concept from Dr. Crenshaw around intersectionality. So intersectionality is known as this overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. And it's this idea that multiple identities intersect to create a whole that is different from the component identities. So as I move through this today, I will talk about some of my own experiences, but also give examples of types of grief and how folks interact with it, and types of resources and who they serve, to give some examples of how might specific resources or experiences that we have with grief relate to not only the fact that, yes, everyone is going to die and everyone grieves, but also it might be that we need different resources or having a different experience because of our identity, our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, how we show up in the world and move through the world, and how folks perceive us. So the types of grief that I'm going to go through today for this 101 session are disenfranchised grief, cultural bereavement, anticipatory grief, traumatic loss and grief, cumulative or compounded grief, and I'll talk about the difference of those words means to me. Secondary losses and grief, suffocated grief, and there's so many more that relate to different types of losses that folks have, ambiguous grief, all of these different types of grief. But this is what I'm going to cover today. And then if you feel like there's a type of grief that's coming up for you that you don't feel reflected here, I really do encourage you to let me know. I will find resources for you. We can chat through it over email. And then also happy to connect to any referrals that specifically would support you or someone that you know through that type of grief. So disenfranchised grief is this grief that's often not recognized, valued, or validated. So there might be with disenfranchised grief this requirement or this ask to prove with numbers and data that there's a disproportionate amount of grief being felt by or experienced in specific communities. So there might be this lack of recognition also of family structures and types of relationships that are common bonds in certain communities. And then there also might be situations where grieving practices, rituals, or types of expression, that mourning, that don't align with wider social, particularly white and Western social norms. So disenfranchised grief is when those family structures or those types of relationships are not valued. For example, it might be that someone is dying in a hospital, and because there's a short list of titles of relationship and like bonds that are allowed to come for visiting time, et cetera, there might be a grief created by this invalidation and devaluing of what someone would call in their life their mother, what someone would call in their life a family member, what someone might call in their life, and that is for them these mothering family or spousal figures, that is invalidated by systems or frameworks of policies that do not allow those folks to show up within, let's say, healthcare institutions, or to have policies like a bereavement policy utilized for those relationships. So that's disenfranchised grief. Again, grief that is not recognized, or relationships that are not recognized that specifically results in the devaluing and invalidation of both the grief that that person in that relationship is experiencing, and also just that relationship as a whole. The next is cultural bereavement. So cultural bereavement can refer to the grief that will come up when someone experiences a loss of a cultural connection. So that might be their identity, that might be a specific community that they come from or that they're attached to. It might be traditions or rituals or practices that their culture is deeply rooted in, or that practices at different times in someone's life, and to be removed from those and unable to access the materials, the spaces, or the people to practice those with can lead to cultural bereavement. It might be this transition as you land in a place, or as someone lands in a place and is grieving and is going through this bereavement period around losing a language or folks around them that speak a specific language. And in general, also just this sense of belonging, this sense of I am with people that mirror back to me, that who I am feels like deeply honored and valued and respected, and I feel seen in other folks. Losing that can often result in cultural bereavement. So this can happen in the context of migration, displacement, some sort of forced relocation, incarceration, colonization, or just major cultural changes that mean a shift in folks having the culture that they are familiar with, and I think less than just familiar, but deeply attached to, shift. So this can result in grief that is not only related to maybe what's been lost, but also this rupture, as I have here. And I think about this tear and this disconnection from the past and the present, from where you were able to, one very specific example that I'll give in the resource list. I usually quote this article about someone moving and leaving behind the home where the smells of their person were still in the clothing hanging in the closet, the grave site of someone that they loved and buried was back home, and they're unable to access it. The language that they were able to, do mourning rituals in, or practice mourning rituals in, they don't have that community around them anymore to go through those rituals. And so it can really be this disruption and tear and rupture of losing that cultural identity and that connection to home, where there may be people or cultural traditions that you're grieving. I will pass around in the resource list. Tita is a death doula and the founder of Meso and the Co-Labyrinth. It has a really beautiful interview with the Dougie Center about how grief and cultural bereavement showed up for her and her family when they moved to the US. And now Tita does an incredible amount of work supporting folks, particularly immigrants and Thai immigrants, around cultural bereavement in the US. The next type of grief that I'll share about is anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief at times is also referred to as anticipatory loss, preparatory grief, but it really conceptually is this distress, and the experience is the distress that a person can feel in the days, months, or even years before the death of a loved one or another impending loss. When we think about anticipatory grief, the reason too that I feel like over the years, this has been such a powerful conversation for folks to be having in the end of life grief and mental health field is because grief doesn't just start the day someone dies. The experience that we have leading up to that, whether someone has received a diagnosis, whether or not they're, maybe navigating some serious illness, or generally in a state that makes it clear and deeply present so much of the time, I think, is what really comes up for me, that our mortality is a reality, death is coming, and we don't have to wait to start grieving until that person dies. It's the anticipation of that loss, the anticipation of what's going to change, the anticipation of, I know that what we've heard and the information that we've gotten means that maybe there's not a specific day and time, but the decline is something that we're now navigating. That is how anticipatory grief can show up for people. And understanding both as providers, like healthcare providers, mental health providers, and then also anyone who works in a workplace or who's supporting a family member or supporting yourself. You do not have to wait to use the words, I am grieving, or I think this is grief, until someone has died. Those feelings, that emotional shift, that mental shift, that full body, full being experience can start to be activated through anticipatory grief long before someone is lost. The next type of grief is specifically related to traumatic loss. So this might be the sudden and unexpected loss of someone. And this includes and is not limited to someone dying as a result of homicide, domestic violence, a war, natural disasters, mass casualties, genocide, folks that have disappeared, folks that you are unable to find, stay in contact with, have a relationship with, it's active. Those traumatic losses can spark a very different type of grief in terms of how our body processes it, our brain processes it, and maybe even for some folks, the type of support that's needed to support through grief after that loss is experienced. One of the things, not specifically because of the loss that I experienced with my mom, but one of the reasons that, pause exists and why we stepped into this work is because when it comes to things like traumatic loss or other types of losses that we have, all the way from parental loss to any type of loss that we have that feels specific to you, I want to validate that what you're feeling might not be supported by every book on grief that you find. Any support group that you go to might not be generalized or specific enough to suit you and what you're navigating specifically. And so I just want to sort of bring that into the room. I love how many resources are out there, and I know many of them are not for me because sometimes I need to sit in a room with specifically women of color who are moms that have also lost their mom. And that experience of they're going to meet me 5, 10, 20 steps deeper into a conversation. They're going to know things before I have to say them. They're going to be able to point me toward other resources or groups or have conversations with me that feel very specific and unique to what we're going through. That is a reality, and I want to affirm and validate that for anyone, whether you're looking for resources or you feel like things just haven't been supportive in the right way or the way that I needed. It might be because what you need and what you're looking for, like it is for so many of us, cannot be met with cookie cutter resources. And this slide and the experience of traumatic loss just comes up for me around that. The next is cumulative and compounded grief. So this is the experience of having multiple losses either at once or compounding on each other. And I like to really sort of drive home what feels like two very different words and concepts to me. So cumulative and compounded. Cumulative to me implies and has this connotation of it's building. They might be layering. I experienced this loss, and we saw a lot of this during the pandemic, especially in early days. I lost this person and I lost my job. And then because of that, I lost my home and then I lost another family member. And so to me, cumulative means that layering and that stacking. When I think about compounded grief, which is typically like for me, when I think about periods where I'm navigating a lot of grief and specific losses or unique losses, compounded implies this pressure. I even feel it in my body when I talk about it. When I think about cumulative, I'm like, all right, we're stacking, they're adding up. And just sort of like being compiled. And when I think about compounded and how deep compounding losses and experiences can sort of weigh on us, I think about this pressure. I think about the experience of feeling the weight grow exponentially. And it's not just here's another loss to put on the list, but when I think about it, it really feels, I can feel it in my body and in my brain. I have a very different picture and connotation for compounding, because it feels like you are holding something new while already deeply and very intensely feeling the weight of all of those previous losses. I'll send around an example from Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, which is a piece that talks about what it's like to lose folks, both, in a death related context, in car crash, incidents, and then also feeling intergenerational sort of grief and trauma coming up from generations of folks being harmed and dying within a specific community, and how compounding all of those grief experiences and losses over generations can feel very, very different. Let's see, second to last that I'm going to talk about is the secondary losses and grief. So these are the losses that can come as a result of, so meaning related to someone dies and then these things happen, or just directly after or after someone dies. So this might be the loss of people who know, identify with, or validate your culture and identity. This might be the loss of dreams and hopes about the future of your family and your community. And this also might be just this loss of a sense of safety in day-to-day life. So a couple of examples are, maybe you are losing someone or someone dies that is your direct tie to your language, and you speak that language and that native language and tongue in your house every day. And it allows you to feel that connection. We talked a bit about this with the cultural bereavement, but it's somebody who really validates and sits with and mirrors and reflects back a piece of you that is grounding from your community or your culture. You might also, as a result of someone dying or a loss, again, you might have this dream of, for me, when my mom died, I hadn't been married and I hadn't had children yet. And as I, even in the last 4 years of processing my mom's death and the birth of my son, it's really been interesting to sort of navigate, oh, well, I thought things were going to look different. I'm grieving this expectation that I had that my son was going to have both of his grandmas, and that my son was going to be able to see himself reflected in me, and then I'd see myself reflected in my mom. And there's been this loss of what I thought my life as a mother was going to look like before the death of my mom. And then also the sense of safety. The death of someone, particularly in certain communities where, you might have homes that are, intergenerational or multifamily, where the folks that you live with every day are the folks that keep you safe. They are the folks that protect you, your children, your grandchildren. They're the folks that are showing up in community and taking care of each other. And when one of those major figures dies, this might mean a loss of a sense of safety in day-to-day life in general, losing that person, losing that protection, losing that connection to community to show up for you or the other folks that are in your household or in your circle. So these secondary losses and grief can be related to a death or a loss, and all of this change and loss and disruption of what your day-to-day maybe looked like and what is going to have to change as a result of that person dying. The last is suffocated grief. So this is a term that has been coined and studied by Dr. Tischel. And this is grief that is not only disenfranchised or dismissed. So we talked about disenfranchised grief in the context of what does it look like for someone's grief over, let's say, the death of a loved one to be devalued because someone doesn't recognize their relationship as being, validated or valued or important, or it's dismissed because folks say, well, you shouldn't be grieving that person. You shouldn't be grieving that person wasn't close enough to you, or that experience shouldn't be something that you are feeling this deeply emotionally. But suffocated grief is a step beyond that, where the expression of that disenfranchised grief is being actively punished. So, this is looking like, for example, and I'll give another link in the resource list to a piece about suffocated grief. But what does it look like for someone to, and particularly Dr. Tichel studies young boys and young men in Louisiana, and how their grief and the way that they might express their grief, let's say at school or in community, looks very different from a white child or a white young man, and how it's into situations where folks might be, those two young folks might be expressing their grief differently, how in one situation it goes punished and the other situation it's validated or understood. So I'll send along a couple of resources, actually, I think by her in our resource list after this. So this next portion is about resources. So I've talked about all of these different kinds of grief. Again, if you don't see what you're experiencing, like, ooh, something's going on in me, in my experience, in the folks that I'm like navigating my grief with, I don't feel like there's something that's not clicking and something I'm still waiting to hear about what kind of grief I'm experiencing, let me know. Happy to send resources and just like tease that out with you. But in terms of resources for grief and mental health, we are here as an organization, and our responsibility is really to answer that question: what is out there and how can you get connected to it? So there are a lot of different resources for processing grief and being held in your grief. Typically, we have found, and even for me in my initial search when I was grieving the death of my mom as I started this work, it was like, okay, I know about support groups. I know about grief groups. There must be a place I can go and sit in a room with some people. I learned that there were grief centers where folks can go and you can receive support for you, your family, your community, and orgs. But also, there's so many other types of places that we can access grief support. And that might be for anyone on the call, or just in general, that might be your local LGBTQ center. There's typically senior grief, older adult and aging, and then also mental health support groups, workshops, courses. Sometimes there are folks who are in residence or supporting on staff as, let's say, wellness or well-being coordinators to support folks through grief and end of life at LGBTQ centers. So that's a place to look. Book clubs, we found, and we refer people out to book clubs where maybe for you are looking for, I have my therapist and I have, maybe you have your therapist and your psych and your doctors, and you have all of the clinical ways to explore your grief. But what does it look like to be in conversation with folks who are exploring grief through writing and storytelling and narrative, and seeing themselves reflected in the pages of others' experiences that they've written about? So you can look for book clubs, and we refer to those. There are webinars like this. There's so many other webinars, talks, videos that are featuring not just folks doing general 101 on like, what is grief, how does it show up, and maybe we'll hold you in some processing space, but also videos talking about videos and talks and webinars talking about, hyper local resources to Los Angeles, what it looks like to plan or access resources around grief, and then whole webinar series about each of the different types of grief even that I talked about today, where you could say, oh, I feel like I'm navigating anticipatory grief, and before my person dies or before I die, I really think there might be something out there that would help me better articulate or find connection to folks around what is this anticipatory grief and how can I care for myself through it. There are also tons and tons of books, films, shows, and different types of media out there. And one of the things that we've seen and known is that being seen in media, being seen in even articles that are written to movies and films and television shows is hugely powerful for folks. Being able to see another Black person, to be able to see another person speaking Spanish, to be able to see another person who maybe has immigrated talk about grief and how it lands with them and what their experience is like can be so incredibly validating and affirming, and actually point toward even further resources that might reflect what you need or ways that you can have conversations with your community. It's just really powerful, I think, to see ourselves reflected in those types of resources. So we have a long list of those as well to refer folks to. And then also associations. There are so many out there that support people through grief and end of life planning and health, sort of like navigating serious illness. And I just put a couple examples up here. We have worked with folks and continue to work with folks who do things like grief labyrinths. We take here, you'll see our book nook. We have about 70 titles, all authored by folks of color about grief and end of life and death, that we pop up all over LA and the US. We work with alumni that we know who do art installations and pop-ups around grief. We run a grief theater and improv workshop every year now. And then I'm always able to refer to books or book clubs that folks can sort of lean on for that more intimate community building. So what I'm going to leave folks with today is what I've put together, and I will put the Google. I'm going to put the Google form, unless Hilda, maybe if you still have it. I have a Google form where you'll be able to access a couple of fields. Just put in like your name, your email, and what you're interested in. And if you'd like resources for some activities that I'm about to share, and then also resources just generally about grief and the work that we're doing at our organization that we can sort of like hook you up with referrals, please put your information in that Google form, or you can email me directly. You'll see my contact information at the end. And one of the activities that I'm going to send around for folks is this menu for griefy moments. So what this is a personal exercise that you can take yourself through. Typically, I have a little bit more time to do this one, so I'll send it to everyone after, and we'll do the quick one that comes next. Is what you'll do is you will take what I have here, which is this this spreadsheet, kind of. It's a chart. And what I encourage you to do is set a timer. And then you'll sit down and you will go through all of these topics and subjects and think about all of the things that you can list that will support you, back to our initial question, to move through your grief. So what are some of the foods that mentally just make you feel like, oh, I am connecting with my person because I'm having a beautiful memory about them when I eat this food? Or things that make you feel like I'm having a really tough day and I want my comfort food, or I'm having a really great day and I want to eat something that I can like take on the go, to go for a walk, and like stay active and keep my mood up, because it means that I can both like support myself as I'm navigating grief, but feel this like continued movement and keep like processing with this upbeat energy. What are the places that make you feel really connected maybe to your person, or where you like to go when you're processing your grief, if you like to do that alone or with other folks? What are some books that have made you feel really wonderful and seen in your grief? What are some books that have nothing to do with grief and death at all that you like to read? Because for me, it was Gilmore Girls. I don't know how many times I watched every single episode of Gilmore Girls after my mom died, but it was interesting because it was, it's a show about a mother and a daughter relationship. And there was something coming up for me where I was just like deeply connected to this show. And so that's something I know I put on at certain times of the year. My husband probably hears and he's like, oh my goodness, look at the calendar. What is the thing that's coming up? Because Elisa is holding something right now. But what you'll do is you can move through this sheet, and I'll give everyone a copy. And then this is a place to draw from when you think, all right, I have a moment coming up, or to give to someone when you have a moment coming up and say, these are the things that can support me. So for this first activity, I'll send you the sheets. And then this second activity is I invite folks to take one small step today. I invite you to, in the chat, complete this sentence. If I was to ask blank for some support during blank, I would love for them to blank. and I'm going to invite you to Mad Lib it. So the first section, what you'll put in there is, who would you ask? If I was to ask, let's say, my best friend for some support during, and what's the season? What's a season that you know your grief always shows up? Maybe you're realizing just now, oh, I've never asked for a day off, for example, around Father's Day. And it's typically a pretty hard holiday for me because my dad died. So it might be if I was to ask my employer for some support during Father's Day, I would love for them to. Then what's the activity? Do you want a day off? Do you not even need a day off and you just want to work from home? Do you want to be able to have a one-on-one with your manager to make sure that you can like have a lovely chat to start the day about something that, you know, is really meaningful or special about your dad? I'll go back to my example. If I was to ask my best friend for some support during, let's say, the holidays, I would love for them to just text me around Christmas and ask how I'm doing, because it really helps when someone checks in and I don't have to reach out and say that I'm having a tough time. So go ahead and Mad Lib it, put in whatever feels right to you. And it's just an example and a thought starter so that before you get off this call or as you end your day, I invite you to ask that person for whatever it is that they could support you with, and to be clear and to be vulnerable, and to advocate for someone to support you, and maybe to think about just one thing from this list. And, you know, going back to this list, just as another example, it might be if I was to ask my employer, again, let's go the employer route. We talk about a lot about grief in the workplace at our organization, for some support during Father's Day. I would love for them to have lunch with me that day so I can leave the office. So that's the end of my portion of the session. I'm going to leave it with Hilda now. I know we have a Q&A, but I just wanted to make sure I could get through everything. And here's for everyone my contact information. Please do not hesitate, whether you're watching this live or you're watching it after, please get in touch with us. Again, this is what we do. This is why we exist. And this is like truly my greatest joy in life, is to be able to resource folks. So you are welcome in my inbox anytime or at any of our future sessions.
Great. Oh, Elisa, before anything, I know you mentioned the Google form for participants to put their information, well, their email in so they get the info. I do have the one from last week. It does have the end of life planning 101 at the top. Is that, should I still drop it in there?
Let's use that one, and I'll know based on the date that they came in. So that works for today. Thank you, Hilda.
Okay, so I just dropped it in the chat, everybody. It does say end of life 101, which is the program that we did last week. So if you actually missed that, you should go ahead and watch that as well, because it's going to tie into some other programming that we have coming up. So we're going to get into FAQ or Q&A. Usually we do Q&A. I'm going to give you all a little bit of time to think about questions if you have any questions, but while we do that, we'll get into the FAQ to get things rolling. Maybe your questions will be answered if you already have a question. So, first question: are there grief resources here in Los Angeles?
Yes. There's so many. A lot of the resources that I put up on the screen before are folks who are here in LA. We know everyone from artists who support folks through processing grief, to grief centers all across Los Angeles in different areas, to programming that we do live. And we also know a ton of death doulas, therapists, grief coaches. So yes, there is no shortage of resources here in LA. And again, our job is to make sure that you find something that resonates with you and your unique experience with grief.
Fantastic. Next question is, what if I don't know what kind of resources might be supportive for me?
Yeah, this is a great question that we typically get, because someone might walk out of a session like this and say, Oh my gosh, I know I need help, but I don't know what I need help with. We have a couple of different like worksheets, and also I invite folks, which I'll send around in the resource list after this. But also we invite folks to do two things: get in touch with us. We can sort of like think about options and look at that with you, and then also we recommend asking your friends, your family, and your community members if you have folks that are safe for you to ask those questions to. What have you done when you were processing grief? What supported you? Have you ever felt like you were grieving and then you actually got help through it? Inviting other people into that conversation might actually bring resources back to you that are like deeply connected to who you are, because they know you better than we could. So I would highly recommend either reaching out to us or reaching out to folks in your community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the last question. What if I'm supporting someone who doesn't think they're grieving?
Yeah, good question. I'm like, these questions at the end are huge, giant questions. But what I will say is that's definitely possible. I've been there before. I think the most important thing to do with folks is to validate and affirm what they know to be true in their body. And we have a lot of tools, and there's a lot of tools and resources out there for how to start a conversation with someone that doesn't say, I know you're grieving, and these are the things that you might need because you need to get better, you need to be acting differently. What's really beautiful about these tools, conversation starters, and cards, and some of them are even card games that'll give you prompts, is that it eases people into a conversation in a way that maybe doing something that feels a little more aggressive, like making assumptions about what they're processing in their body, feels like. And then one other option is to give someone a care package truly that is framed as an intention, like the intention behind it is a care package, with the resource that you think might be supportive to them. That might open the door. It might open just a little crack to being able to have a conversation about something like grief or what they might need care around without you making assumptions and labeling things in a way that they might not describe it themselves.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Elisa, for this presentation
Thank
and all the
you.
amazing information. And for everybody who is watching this right now, if you miss out on any part of the presentation, remember that it has been recorded. So go ahead and watch the playback if you missed anything. And again, if you want to check out the End of Life 101 from last week, that's also on our YouTube channel for Los Angeles Public Library. And I want to also let you all know there's much more coming with Pause. So stay with me now. So tomorrow we have another streaming program. So tomorrow is actually the Ask a Physician: Clinicians and Grief, Understanding Medical Encounters Through a Grief Lens. So that's tomorrow, same time, same place, 12:30 p.m. here on YouTube, streaming live. So please join us and come with questions because that's what we're here for. And okay, the next one, these other things are happening in person. So I want to mention, again, part of Thrive LA Pause will be offering a series of called End of Life Planning 101, which I keep mentioning, but we're going to be continuing it at the Lakeview Terrace Branch Library and the West Valley Regional Branch Library. It will start on July 18th at Lakeview Terrace and July 20th at West Valley. So again, those are in person. So if you're in the area, if you have time, please check them out. They're going to be great. You're going to have so much information. Elisa is thorough with all of this. So join us. Thank you all so much for joining us once again. And I hope to see you on the chat tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. Hope you have a great rest of your day.